Good evening, fellow history enthusiasts and sleep seekers. My name is Eden, and I'm your host for tonight's journey into the American past. Here on this channel, we believe history isn't just about dates and names. It's about stories, the real, unvarnished stories that sometimes get lost in the grand narratives. And what better way to truly absorb these tales than by letting them gently guide you into a restful night's sleep? Tonight, we're not just telling a story, we're deconstructing a legend. We're diving deep into the real Wild West. Not the Hollywood version with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the gritty, dangerous reality where survival was never guaranteed. You might think you're tough enough to handle it, but trust me, there's a reason they called it wild. And for those of us accustomed to modern conveniences like indoor plumbing, readily available food, and, well, basic hygiene, the Wild West was a truly alien landscape. We'll be peeling back those layers of romanticism to reveal the truly fascinating and sometimes, frankly, disgusting truths of daily life on the frontier. Our aim tonight is to provide you with not just knowledge, but also a calming narrative, a journey through history that's both informative and incredibly relaxing. Think of it as a historical lullaby, designed to ease your mind while expanding your understanding of a pivotal era. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are listening from. So drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why you might not survive even a single day in the untamed American frontier. And as we begin, I have a little thought experiment for you. If you could magically transport yourself to any specific moment or place in the Wild West, where would it be? And what's the very first thing you do? Let me know in the comments, and perhaps I'll try to incorporate some of your interests into future episodes as well. For now, prepare to drift. Congratulations! You've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news, you're about to experience a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news, your chances of survival just dropped dramatically. The very first challenge hits you before you even open your eyes. The smell. Not the earthy, pleasant aroma of nature you might expect, but something far more pungent. Imagine the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and what might possibly be raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't exactly a perfumed garden. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a thorough wash a monthly luxury, and even that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a proper bath. Water, as you might imagine, was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when you desperately needed it for drinking and cooking. So, if you're a clean freak, well, you'd likely have been quite literally stinking rich in odors from your very first day. And these natural fragrances weren't just unpleasant. They were indicators of the rampant health challenges. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were notorious hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. We're talking about constant threats like cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. An outbreak of any of these could wipe out half a town in mere weeks. Forget your hand sanitizer, it wouldn't have stood a chance. As you walk down the main street, the smell hits you again, even stronger now. Horse manure is everywhere because horses were the main mode of transportation. There were no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies would swarm around you, and you quickly realize why disease spread so easily here. Your modern immune system, used to filtered water and sanitized surfaces, would be utterly overwhelmed. It's enough to make you truly appreciate your modern bathroom, isn't it? So, ponder this as you drift further. If you could bring one modern invention back to the Wild West to improve daily life, what would it be? Would it be hand soap, a water filter, or perhaps something more ambitious, like a modern sewer system? Imagine the impact, and then try to imagine the sheer logistics of implementing it back then. You can share your imaginative solutions in the comments below. Your stomach growls, a familiar companion in this era, reminding you it's time for breakfast. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, because that's likely what you'll be having, possibly for every meal of the day. The Wild West diet was notoriously monotonous and, perhaps more critically, nutritionally deficient. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare luxuries, available only seasonally, a few months at most. Imagine an entire winter diet with absolutely no fresh produce whatsoever. This significant lack of dietary variety often led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, was common during the long winter and early spring months when fresh produce was simply non-existent. The symptoms were horrifying, though well known: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and, if left untreated, death. Other deficiency diseases also affected growth in children and caused various chronic health problems in adults. It puts your daily multivitamin into perspective, doesn't it? Food preservation was a constant challenge and an absolutely critical survival skill. Without the marvel of refrigeration, meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved through methods like smoking, heavy salting, or drying. While these methods did deter bacterial growth, they drastically changed flavors and textures, often reducing the nutritional value. The heavy salt content in preserved foods, for example, contributed to high blood pressure and other health issues in later life. Women, in particular, spent enormous amounts of time preserving food when it was abundant, ensuring supplies for the scarce periods. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented, fruits were dried or preserved with sugar if it was available. Root vegetables might be stored in cool, underground root cellars. These efforts weren't optional, they were essential survival work that literally determined whether a family would eat through the winter. Food storage presented its own unique problems. Even properly preserved foods could spoil due to improper techniques, leading to potentially deadly food poisoning. And of course, stored food was a magnet for pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed portions of most stored food supplies, and their droppings contaminated what remained. Most frontier families simply accepted a certain amount of insect parts and rodent droppings in their flour, beans, and other staples as unavoidable. Bon appetit! You might think the coffee would at least be good. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in the movies, right? But what you're served barely resembles what you'd recognize as coffee. It was typically boiled to within an inch of its life, bitter beyond belief, and might even include crushed eggshells or salt to supposedly reduce the bitterness. Still, the caffeine would help you face the day, so you'd drink it without complaint. Sometimes necessity truly overrides taste. As you gently drift, imagine yourself at a frontier dinner table. What single food item from your modern pantry would you miss the most in this world of beans, biscuits, and unique coffee? Share your answers in the comments below. Perhaps it's fresh fruit, or maybe even just a decent cup of morning brew. Before heading outside for your day, you might want to check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that could have sought shelter during the night. It wasn't uncommon for frontier folks to shake out their boots each morning, a habit born from painful experience. One wrong move and you could be facing a venomous bite miles from any medical help. This wasn't just a quirky habit, it was a daily survival ritual. Stepping outside your cabin, you're immediately aware of how exposed you are. The vast landscape of the American frontier was breathtaking, sure, but it was also utterly unforgiving. Extreme weather could appear with little warning. Blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, or drought could all mean death for the unprepared. The sky might be clear now, but that could change in minutes. Your weather apps certainly wouldn't be much help out here. If you've settled in a frontier town, you might think civilization offers some protection. In some ways, that's true. In others, it just presents different dangers. Towns in the Wild West were, as we briefly mentioned, hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage systems or understanding of germ theory, illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats. An outbreak could wipe out half a town in weeks. Your modern public health department would have a complete meltdown. Speaking of towns, let's say you decide to visit one today. As you approach, you notice there's a distinct lack of the organized layout you might expect. Many Western towns grew haphazardly, with buildings constructed wherever convenient, often without proper planning or infrastructure. The streets aren't paved. Instead, they're dirt tracks that transform into mud pits when it rains and dust bowls when it's dry. And that pervasive smell hits you again, even stronger now. Horse manure is everywhere because horses are the main transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some towns, the accumulated waste could be knee-deep in heavily trafficked areas. Flies swarm around you, and you realize why disease spreads so easily here. It's a very vivid, if unpleasant, sensory experience. As you walk down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest establishments in town. Contrary to Hollywood depictions, saloons weren't glamorous places with swinging doors and piano players. Most were crude, one-room affairs with rough plank bars and basic furniture. And the liquor served? It wasn't fine whiskey aged in oak barrels, but raw alcohol, often mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it extra kick. A single drink could actually blind you if you were unlucky. The saloon represents another deadly aspect of frontier life: violence. These establishments were frequently sites of deadly confrontations, not because of formal duels or showdowns, but because of drunken arguments that escalated quickly in a heavily armed society. The romanticized gunfights of Western movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters, not quite the dramatic standoff you might imagine. As you settle deeper, imagine navigating these frontier towns. What part of the town experience, the smell, the disease, or the dubious quality of the saloon beverages, do you think would be the most challenging for you to deal with on a daily basis? Share your choice in the comments below, and let's see which hardship is most universal. Speaking of navigating town, you'll notice almost everyone carries a weapon of some kind, but perhaps not for the reasons you might think. While personal protection was certainly a factor, weapons were primarily tools for hunting, protection from wildlife, think bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes, and sometimes even for signaling. Going unarmed, especially when traveling between settlements, would have been considered foolish. Now, here's a surprising twist from Hollywood. You might be surprised to learn that many frontier towns actually had strict gun control laws. Places like Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, for instance, required visitors to surrender their firearms when entering town limits. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral actually started because the Clanton gang refused to comply with Tombstone's weapons ordinance. So the image of everyone walking around with guns blazing? Not always the case. Despite what you've seen in movies, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street were exceedingly rare. Most shootings were ambushes or happened during robberies. The skilled gunslinger facing off against an opponent at high noon is largely a Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was typically sudden, chaotic, and lacked any sense of honor or fairness. Think less high noon, more drunken brawl gone terribly wrong. Bar fights that escalated to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic shootouts on dusty streets. It was a world where grudges festered, and quick tempers, fueled by raw alcohol, could turn deadly in an instant. Your modern sense of due process would be quite bewildered by the swift, often brutal nature of conflict resolution. As for law enforcement in this supposedly lawless land, the reality was complex and varied widely by location. Major cities and towns typically had some form of organized law enforcement, but vast rural areas had minimal, if any, official protection. County sheriffs were elected officials responsible for maintaining order across sometimes enormous territories. A single sheriff might be the only law enforcement for thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. They relied heavily on deputizing ordinary citizens during emergencies, creating posses to pursue criminals or respond to violence. Town marshals handled law enforcement within town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in larger settlements. These positions were often dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and those who simply enjoyed the power the badge provided. Some famous lawmen, like Wyatt Earp, moved between legitimate law enforcement and more questionable enterprises throughout their careers. Federal marshals had jurisdiction throughout territories and states, but they were few in number. They typically focused on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or offenses involving multiple jurisdictions. The legendary U.S. Marshals of Western movies single-handedly bringing law to lawless towns were largely fictional creations. In many remote areas, justice was handled through informal community action rather than official legal processes. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when formal law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups maintained basic order, but they could easily become vehicles for prejudice, personal vendettas, or mob violence. The concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If you were accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of your actual guilt or innocence. Criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was the standard penalty for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, particularly of horses or cattle. Prisons existed but were primitive facilities with high mortality, disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to the expense of long-term imprisonment. As you let these facts about frontier justice settle in, consider this. If you lived in the Wild West, would you prefer to rely on the formal but often absent law enforcement, or would you put your trust in a local vigilante group? Think about the pros and cons of each and share your thoughts in the comments. It's a choice that could mean the difference between life and death. If you became ill or injured in the 1870s West, your experience would bear almost no resemblance to modern healthcare. The first, and perhaps most striking difference, would be the absence of professional medical care in most situations. Doctors were incredibly scarce, with many communities having none at all. Imagine a town with no doctor, no clinic, no emergency room, just you and your wits. Those who did practice on the frontier often had minimal training, perhaps a brief apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college. Their knowledge reflected the medical science of the era, which still relied heavily on theories like humoral balance that had more in common with medieval medicine than modern practice. Without access to professional care, most health issues were addressed through home remedies and folk medicine. Every community had people, usually women, known for their healing skills, drawing on traditions brought from various cultures. Some of these treatments, particularly herbal remedies, had genuine medicinal properties, but many were ineffective or actively harmful. Common medical treatments of the era included bloodletting, which often weakened already ill patients, and purgatives that caused severe diarrhea, supposedly to expel bad humors. Imagine being sick and then intentionally having your blood drained. You can almost feel yourself getting weaker just thinking about it. Poultices of various substances were applied to wounds, some of which, unfortunately, introduced infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, leading to addiction in many cases. Mercury compounds were also prescribed for numerous conditions, despite their known toxicity. Even when treatments had some validity, impure medications caused problems. Without pharmaceutical regulations or standardization, commercially sold medicines varied wildly in potency and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many patent medicines marketed as cure-alls contained primarily alcohol, providing temporary relief through intoxication rather than addressing underlying conditions. It was truly a case of buyer beware, but when you're desperate, you try anything. Surgery in frontier conditions was particularly horrific. Without effective anesthesia beyond alcohol, whiskey, or opium, patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was either unknown or inconsistently practiced, leading to rampant post-surgical infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be wiped clean but never properly sterilized. A simple broken bone could easily become a life-threatening scenario. Childbirth represented perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier and modern medical experiences. Women typically gave birth at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or by female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until labor was well underway. Breech births, hemorrhage, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last experience in life. Men's diaries and letters from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. The combined impact of inadequate nutrition, constant physical strain, minimal preventative care, and primitive treatment options meant that frontier populations experienced health outcomes more similar to developing nations today than to modern America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years, with those surviving childhood likely to suffer chronic health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. The phrase, "only the strong survived," had a very literal meaning in the Wild West, especially when it came to health. As you let these challenging realities sink in, consider this. If you found yourself gravely ill or injured on the frontier, would you put your faith in the local doctor and his dubious treatments, or would you rely solely on home remedies and sheer luck? It's a terrifying choice, isn't it? Feel free to share your survival strategy in the comments. Perhaps a truly restful sleep is the best medicine after all. Beyond basic survival needs like food and shelter, frontier life presented unique challenges for families raising children. If you had been born in the Wild West rather than just visiting it, your childhood would have been dramatically different from modern experiences. Childhood itself was conceived differently in the 19th century. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute meaningful work to family survival, not as educational chores, but as essential economic contributions. Young children minded livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, watched younger siblings, and helped with countless other tasks that freed adults for heavier work. By age 10 or 12, most frontier children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys followed fathers into fields, barns, or workshops, learning skills through direct participation rather than formal instruction. Girls worked with mothers, learning the complex domestic skills necessary for frontier homemaking, not simple housekeeping, but the production of essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. It was a childhood of constant practical learning, with very little idle time. This early adulthood extended to other areas of life. Children were not sheltered from the harsh realities around them. They witnessed births, deaths, the slaughtering of animals, and the sometimes violent conflicts of frontier communities. They were expected to understand and adapt to these realities rather than being protected from them. Education, as modern people understand it, was limited and inconsistent on the frontier. In established towns, schools might operate for a few months each year, typically during winter when agricultural work was minimal. One teacher, often barely educated themselves, might be responsible for students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, all studying in a single room. Physical conditions in these schools were challenging. Buildings were poorly insulated, leading to freezing conditions in winter and stifling heat in warmer months. Supplies were minimal, perhaps a few shared textbooks, slates for writing that had to be constantly erased and reused, and minimal paper that was treated as a precious resource. Corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach, with whipping or beatings administered for infractions as minor as whispering or failing to memorize assigned material. In more remote areas, formal schooling might not exist at all. Some families conducted home education using whatever books were available, but many frontier children received only the most basic literacy and calculation skills, if that. Their education focused instead on practical knowledge: how to predict weather, track animals, prepare soil for planting, treat common injuries, and perform the countless other tasks essential for survival. Quite a different curriculum, wouldn't you agree? Child mortality remained devastatingly high throughout the frontier period. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest risk in the first 5 years of life. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevent or treat, measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. Accidents claims many more, as child safety was a foreign concept in an era where survival often demanded risk-taking. The psychological impact of this mortality on both children and parents is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Most children grew up watching siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often gave the same name to a subsequent child if an older sibling died young. A practice that seems strange today, but reflected the different relationship with mortality in an era when death was an everyday presence. It was a constant shadow over every family, a silent testament to the fragility of life on the frontier. As you let the quiet reality of frontier childhood settle in, consider this. If you were a child growing up in the Wild West, what practical skill do you think you would have excelled at? And what modern comfort would you miss the most from your 21st century life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps a good night's sleep is one of those comforts you'd miss the most. This isolation was particularly difficult for those accustomed to more settled environments. Women who had grown up with close female friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or even weeks while husbands traveled for supplies or work. Their diaries frequently mention crippling loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversation for extended periods. It was a profound quiet, not always peaceful, but often unsettling in its emptiness. This profound isolation sometimes led to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness. This was a severe depression, intense anxiety, and occasionally psychosis, often triggered by the brutal combination of isolation, constant work, and the relentless environmental hardships. Some affected individuals sadly became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned east, unable to endure the psychological pressure of frontier life. It was a silent epidemic, far from the dramatic gunfights, but just as deadly to the spirit. Even in established communities, social connections were limited by practical constraints. Visiting neighbors might require traveling several miles each way, a significant undertaking when time was precious and transportation limited to walking or horseback. Formal social gatherings were infrequent, typically centered around church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches played a crucial role in frontier communities beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the community connection they provided. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers frequently took on roles far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. These were the anchors in a sea of uncertainty. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in frontier development. Building a school, a church, or a meeting hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary exploitation. These institutions helped transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. The creation of local governments, rudimentary as they often were, similarly marked transitions from frontier chaos to established community. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action, which were absolutely necessary for survival in such harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, ensuring crops were gathered before unpredictable weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties formed when children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no individual or family could survive the frontier completely through self-reliance. It was a constant dance between rugged independence and vital teamwork. This community interdependence existed alongside the individualism that later became mythologized in frontier narratives. Both elements were necessary responses to frontier conditions: self-reliance for daily survival and community cooperation for challenges beyond individual capacity. The tension between these values shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. A truly complex tapestry, wouldn't you say? The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've somehow survived the night, a victory in itself in the Wild West. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take. Perhaps you decide to leave town today, to travel across the frontier. Whether you're heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or simply exploring, travel in the 1870s was an entirely different experience than what you're used to. The good news is that by this time, the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, connecting the east and west coasts of America. The bad news? Unless you were relatively wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably couldn't afford to use it. Most frontier folks traveled by horse, wagon, or simply on foot. If you owned a horse, consider yourself fortunate. Horses were expensive to buy and maintain, putting them out of reach for many settlers. A good horse might cost the equivalent of several months' wages. Then you needed saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care. Though veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if it broke a leg or developed certain illnesses. Quite a practical, if grim, approach to animal husbandry. Riding itself was no pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't designed for comfort, but for function. Hours in the saddle left even experienced riders with blisters and aching muscles. And if your horse spooked at a snake or a sudden noise, which happened frequently, you could easily be thrown, potentially suffering broken bones or worse, miles from any help. Your modern helmet and padded cycling shorts would offer little comfort out here. If you couldn't afford a horse, you might travel by wagon. Forget the romantic image of pioneers cheerfully rolling across pristine prairies. Wagon travel was brutally uncomfortable. The vehicles had no suspension system beyond the slight give in wooden wheels, meaning you felt every rock, rut, and hole in the trail. The constant jarring caused wagon sickness, similar to seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous and miserable. Roads, if they existed at all, were typically just dirt tracks carved by previous travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires where wagons could sink axle deep. During dry periods, the dust was so thick you could barely breathe or see. Wagons frequently broke down, with wheels cracking or axles snapping miles from the nearest settlement. Roadside assistance was not an option. Let's say you've decided to journey all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train heading west on the famous Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the most perilous undertakings of the 19th century. Of the approximately 400,000 people who attempted it between the 1840s and 1860s, an estimated 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail was sometimes called the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate that an average of 10 to 15 people died for every mile of the trail. Think about that. A grave every 300 feet or so for 2,000 miles. The trail was literally lined with makeshift crosses and stone markers, many without names, as families were forced to bury loved ones and continue their arduous journey. Disease was the #1 killer on the Oregon Trail. Cholera, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water, was particularly devastating. This horrible illness caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body of fluids so quickly that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. There was no effective treatment available. Wagon trains would sometimes lose dozens of people in a single cholera outbreak. Other diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and mountain fever claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple children during the journey. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often consisting of folk remedies that did little to help and sometimes made conditions worse. Crossing rivers presented another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, but pioneers had to cross numerous rivers on their journey west. Wagons frequently capsized in these crossings, drowning people and livestock and destroying precious supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake Rivers alone claimed hundreds of lives during the migration period. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were relatively rare. Most tribes were actually helpful to migrants, offering supplies, guidance, and assistance with river crossings. The majority of violent deaths on the trail came from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearms accidents were shockingly common, as most travelers were inexperienced with weapons but carried them for hunting and protection. So, less cowboys and Indians, and more watch your step. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents, and spouses along the way, then had to continue traveling immediately. There was no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant less chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made passes impossible. The constant stress, grief, and physical hardship led many travelers to mental breakdown. Suicide was not uncommon among trail migrants. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges weren't over. Many arrived at their destination having spent all their money and resources on the journey itself. Families often arrived destitute, malnourished, and ill, only to find that the promised land had its own harsh realities. But let's say you've decided not to travel that far. Perhaps you're heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West presented significant dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who saw lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While the frequency of stagecoach robberies was exaggerated in later fiction, they did occur regularly enough to be a legitimate concern. The natural environment posed constant threats to travelers. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travelers. Summer heat in desert regions could kill through dehydration and heat stroke. Winter blizzards routinely trapped travelers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths or desperate situations like the infamous Donner Party, where survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Navigation itself was challenging in an era before detailed maps. Travelers relied on vague directions, landmarks that could change or be misidentified, and the experience of guides who sometimes proved unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if your supplies ran low. As you gently drift off, imagine planning a journey across the Wild West. What single item from your modern life would you desperately wish you could pack to make that journey safer or more comfortable? A GPS, a water purifier, or perhaps just a really good map? Let me know your travel essential in the comments below. As you travel today, you might notice another aspect of frontier life that movies rarely depict accurately: the stunning diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a true meeting ground of cultures from around the world. Chinese immigrants worked tirelessly as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had been living in the Southwest long before it even became U.S. territory. Black cowboys, a significant force often overlooked in popular narratives, made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their unique cultures and traditions, hoping for a new life. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before others arrived. It was a vibrant, often chaotic, mosaic of humanity. This rich diversity, however, didn't automatically translate into equality or harmony. Racial violence was, unfortunately, a common feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers, for instance, faced brutal discrimination and were often forced to take the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than their white counterparts. Chinese miners were frequently driven from productive claims through violence or unjust application of foreign miners' taxes. And Chinese communities in frontier towns often faced riots and mass expulsions when economic conditions deteriorated. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major American law restricting immigration based on nationality, grew directly from this deep-seated anti-Chinese sentiment. Mexican landowners frequently saw their property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War, despite treaty guarantees. Even their Spanish-derived water rights systems, which had functioned effectively for generations in arid environments, were often replaced with English common law approaches less suited to the region. Black Americans who moved west hoping to escape Southern discrimination often found frontier racism just as entrenched, if different in form, despite their crucial contributions to ranching, mining, and building frontier communities. They were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance, a heartbreaking continuation of injustice. For Native Americans, the expansion of white settlement was nothing short of catastrophic. The indigenous population of North America, once numbering perhaps 15 million people, had been reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. This devastation was caused by a horrific combination of disease, warfare, forced relocation, and the deliberate destruction of their food sources, particularly the buffalo. The near extinction of the American bison, the buffalo, stands as perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative approach. In the 1700s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This wasn't simply the result of hunting for food or hides, though that played a part. It was also deliberate policy encouraged by the U.S. government as a way to deprive Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he spoke these exact words, they accurately reflect government policy of the era. The destruction of the buffalo herds was environmental warfare designed to break indigenous resistance by eliminating their way of life. U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from their traditional lands onto reservations, often in areas with poor soil and few resources. Treaties were regularly broken when valuable resources were discovered on reservation lands. Native children were taken from their families and placed in boarding schools designed to erase their cultural identity, operating under the philosophy of "kill the Indian, save the man." These children had their hair cut short, were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining their cultural identities. The intergenerational trauma from these policies continues to affect Native communities today. The romanticized Cowboys versus Indians narratives of later films grossly misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many Native nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt to changing circumstances. Violence typically erupted only after repeated treaty violations, encroachment on tribal lands, or deliberate provocations. Armed resistance almost invariably ended in defeat, though some groups maintained independence longer than others. The tragedy of this cultural collision was heightened by the fact that many Native nations had sophisticated agricultural systems, complex governance structures, and rich cultural traditions that could have offered valuable knowledge to European settlers. Different approaches to land use and ownership created fundamental misunderstandings. Many Native groups couldn't conceive of owning land any more than one could own the air or stars, making treaty negotiations over territory fundamentally problematic from the start. The collision of these diverse groups, each with their own values, practices, and expectations, created frontier communities far more complex and conflict-ridden than later romantic depictions would suggest. The melting pot metaphor, popularized in later American mythology, obscured both the persistent cultural distinctiveness of various groups and the power imbalances that determined whose cultures would be preserved and whose would be suppressed. A truly complex and often painful chapter of history. As you let these layers of cultural history gently drift into your mind, consider this. If you could witness one specific moment of cultural exchange or conflict on the frontier, what would it be? And what lesson do you think it might teach us today about diversity and understanding? Share your reflections in the comments below, and perhaps find peace in understanding the past. As you continue your journey, you might ponder another group whose experience differed markedly from Hollywood depictions. Women on the frontier. Far from the helpless damsels or school moms of Western movies, frontier women performed incredibly demanding physical labor while navigating restrictive social expectations. On homesteads and farms, women not only handled traditional domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothing, but also worked in the fields, tended livestock, and even defended the home when necessary. Their workday typically started before dawn and often ended well after dark, with few, if any, days of rest. Imagine a day where a frontier woman might need to plow fields in the morning, then deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, perhaps fight off predators threatening the livestock in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her own children throughout the day. It was a ceaseless cycle of labor, with no real off switch. Many women became widows young due to the dangerous nature of frontier life, and often had to manage farms or businesses alone while raising children, facing immense pressure. Despite their essential contributions, women generally had very few legal rights. In most territories and states, they couldn't vote, couldn't own property independently if married, or even have custody of their children in the event of a divorce. Domestic violence was largely considered a private matter, with little to no legal recourse available to victims. It was a world where their incredible strength was often taken for granted, and their voices rarely heard in the halls of power. For unmarried women, options were severely limited. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions, though female teachers were typically paid significantly less than their male counterparts, and were often expected to resign upon marriage. Some women did find economic independence through running boarding houses, working as nurses, or establishing millinery or dressmaking businesses. These were small pockets of autonomy in a largely restrictive society. Then there were the soiled doves, prostitutes who worked in frontier brothels and saloons. While later mythology often romanticized these women, the reality was typically grim. Many entered the profession purely out of economic desperation, after being widowed or abandoned, with few other options for survival. Physical abuse, drug addiction, often from laudanum, as we discussed earlier, and venereal disease were common hazards of the work. Even those who managed to earn substantial money found themselves socially ostracized and largely unable to transition to more respectable positions in society. Their lives were frequently short and tragic, far from the glamorous figures sometimes portrayed. However, some women did find greater freedom on the frontier than they might have back east. The shortage of women in Western territories sometimes gave them more marriage options and occasionally better treatment as communities competed to attract and keep female residents. It was a matter of supply and demand, in a way. A few territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women voting rights decades before the 19th Amendment, recognizing their essential contributions to frontier development and community building. These were significant, albeit isolated, steps towards equality, driven by the unique needs and circumstances of the expanding West. So, while life was incredibly hard, there were glimmers of progressive change emerging. As you settle deeper into relaxation, consider the immense strength of these frontier women. If you lived in the Wild West, what daily task or societal expectation do you think would be the most difficult for you to bear as a woman? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Perhaps it's a quiet appreciation for the relatively easy life we live today that will help you drift off tonight.
Morning arrives again in the Wild West, and with it comes hunger, a constant companion on the frontier. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take. Today, perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns where fortunes are supposedly made overnight. You've heard stories of the California gold rush, the Nevada silver strikes, and the Colorado mining booms. Tales of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight have drawn hundreds of thousands west. What these stories often don't mention, however, are the brutal realities awaiting those who chased mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually entail? First, you'd need to stake a claim, which means finding unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits, increasingly difficult by the 1870s as the easiest and richest areas were claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, which could be substantial. Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. For placer mining, searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the hunched position. And after all that effort, you'd be lucky to find a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies. Not exactly striking it rich, is it? If you ventured into hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge led to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide, odorless but deadly, suffocated miners who had no warning of the danger. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through rock was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely or thrown rock fragments became deadly projectiles. The thunderous noise and constant percussion of blasting left many with permanent hearing loss. Even if you avoided immediate catastrophes, the long-term health effects were devastating. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust, leading to silicosis, a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. Mercury, used in gold processing, caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing chronic illness and early death. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available. It was a truly brutal existence. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12-hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Quite the ironic twist.
Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young, single men engaged in dangerous work, with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American today. Violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal, with minimal planning or infrastructure. Human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. Not exactly a vacation spot. If you managed to find valuable ore, you then faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold dust or ore, making them prime targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Without federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it made one a target for robbery. Quite the financial tightrope walk. Perhaps, after considering the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, with demand for beef in eastern cities creating opportunities on the frontier. Surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt, purchasing these necessities, betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature, however, often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887, when up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death during unusually severe weather. Disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on livestock, particularly vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries further reduced herds. It was a constant battle against the elements and the wild.
The iconic cattle drives, moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points, were not romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned cowboys and cattle alike. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable, destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death, far from a carefree life on the range. The cowboy's life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies. Injuries, common in such dangerous work, often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. Definitely not a career for the faint of heart. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal after all. What about farming? Surely growing food, the most fundamental of human activities, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier? The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality, however, proved far more challenging than the promise. First, 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprised much of the available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments, where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains, constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These soddies were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Your modern home, with its sturdy walls and leak-proof roof, would be a palace in comparison. Then came the back-breaking work of breaking the land for planting. Prairie sod, held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries, was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields. Early frost could kill crops just before harvest. And then there were the grasshoppers, which descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating the handles of tools left in fields. Your pest control efforts would be utterly useless. Disease affected frontier farmers as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working the fields while heavily pregnant or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools broke and caused injuries. Animals panicked and trampled their handlers. Even successful harvests could turn deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain, or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents. A truly perilous profession, from start to finish. The isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away, visited only occasionally. Women in particular suffered from this isolation, some going months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. The silence could be deafening and destructive. For those who persevered through these challenges and actually produced crops, economic obstacles remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies often used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. It was a constant uphill battle, even for the most hard-working individuals. As you gently drift off, imagine yourself in the Wild West, needing to earn a living. Which of these frontier occupations, mining, ranching, or farming, do you think you'd be most likely to attempt, despite all the challenges? And which would you avoid at all costs? Let me know your frontier career choice in the comments below, and may your dreams be filled with far fewer dangers. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier, working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. And in some ways, it did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but it certainly introduced its own unique hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Imagine working with massive gears and belts completely exposed. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Your modern safety regulations and hard hats would be utterly alien concepts. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and sheer exhaustion. Chinese workers who built much of the transcontinental railroad were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. It was a brutal, thankless job, often for meager pay. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. And perhaps most disturbingly, child labor was common. Children as young as 8 or 9 worked alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their smaller size and inexperience. They were not just playing in the fields, they were vital, vulnerable parts of the workforce. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. It was a system designed to keep labor cheap and compliant. Company towns, settlements where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in script, company currency, rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough to escape the system. Imagine being perpetually tied to your employer, unable to leave even if conditions were unbearable, a truly restrictive form of freedom. As you gently drift off, consider this. If you were forced to work in a frontier town, knowing the risks, would you prefer the dangerous but possibly independent life of a miner, or the stable but potentially exploitative life of a wage laborer in a company town? Which devil would you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and may your own work week be infinitely more comfortable.
Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, frontier life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time itself. It wasn't the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality governed by daylight, seasons, and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset, their active hours expanding and contracting with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion: fields plowed, cattle moved, or ore extracted. During harvest or roundup, people might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier. With few clocks and limited need for precise timing in most activities, people operated on approximate schedules. Morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Your smartwatches would be utterly useless here. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting workdays, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire,
Storytelling or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Your streaming services wouldn't have quite the same appeal. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbors or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment: tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. These were the rare moments of collective joy, deeply cherished in their scarcity. As the day draws to a close, you find yourself in a frontier town undergoing rapid transformation, a transition happening across the West during the 1870s and 1880s. The initial phase of settlement, characterized by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale enterprises, was giving way to more organized corporate development of Western resources. The arrival of railroads catalyzed this transition. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, dramatically reduced travel time between East and West from months to days. Subsequent branch lines penetrated previously isolated regions, connecting them to national markets and supply chains. This transportation revolution allowed large-scale extraction of Western resources for Eastern factories and mass-produced Eastern goods to flood Western markets. These economic connections accelerated the integration of Western regions into national systems, but often disadvantaged small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with large mining corporations that brought industrial methods and capital investment. Family farms struggled against agricultural enterprises operating on vast acreage. Small ranchers found themselves squeezed by cattle companies with investor backing and political connections.
Corporate interests increasingly dominated political as well as economic structures. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and large landholders exercised enormous influence over territorial and early state governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were allocated through processes that typically favored those with financial and political power rather than small operators or community interests. This transition from frontier to integrated region wasn't simply economic, but cultural. The rough-edged mining camp or cattle town gradually acquired institutions that signaled permanence and connection to wider society. Banks, schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal organizations. Streets were surveyed and sometimes paved. Wooden structures were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments enacted ordinances regulating behavior that had previously gone ungoverned. For many who had been attracted to the frontier precisely because of its freedom from Eastern constraints, these changes represented unwelcome domestication of the wild spaces they had sought. Some continually moved westward ahead of advancing civilization, seeking new frontiers. Others struggled to adapt to increasing regulation, competition, and social expectations.
The mythological end of the frontier, declared in the 1890s, represented real psychological and cultural challenges for those whose identities were tied to frontier conditions. Part of this transformation involved the taming, or at least management, of frontier violence. The iconic gunfighters and outlaws who would later dominate Western mythology operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was establishing itself against pre-existing systems of personal and community violence. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional police forces and court systems had replaced vigilante justice in most established communities, though remote areas still saw occasional eruptions of frontier-style conflict resolution. The legendary figures who captured public imagination, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, operated in this transitional period, often moving back and forth between legal and illegal activities as circumstances changed. Their later mythologism obscured the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, far from the perfect marksman of legend, shot bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked variously as a lawman, gambler, brothel keeper, and vigilante across his career. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. The reality was far messier than the legend. As you let these facts about time, transformation, and legend settle, consider this. If you could attend any one of the frontier's forms of entertainment, a community dance with live music, a baseball game, or a storytelling session around a fire, which would you choose for a night out? Share your ideal frontier leisure activity in the comments below, and prepare to truly relax.
As evening approaches on your final day in the Wild West, you find yourself contemplating the profound gap between frontier reality and the mythology that would later emerge from it. Why did Americans, and eventually the world, become so fascinated with a romanticized version of this brutal period? What needs did these myths serve, and what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in timing. The most intense period of frontier mythology making occurred precisely as the actual frontier was disappearing. The Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody began in the 1880s, featuring staged reenactments of Indian battles and stagecoach robberies for Eastern audiences, even as railroads, telegraph lines, and formal governance were integrating Western regions into mainstream American society. These performances weren't meant as accurate historical recreations, but as entertainment that resonated with Eastern ideas about the West. The dime novels that popularized exaggerated tales of Western heroes originated not on the frontier, but in Eastern publishing houses, written by authors who rarely had first-hand experience of the regions they described. These formulaic stories emphasized action, clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as a testing ground for American virtues of self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later, Hollywood Westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating iconic images of lone cowboys, heroic sheriffs, dastardly outlaws, and savage Indians that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These films served psychological and cultural functions beyond entertainment. They offered reassuring narratives about American identity during periods of rapid social change and international challenges. The mythology suggested that American character had been forged in frontier conditions, producing exceptional qualities that distinguish the nation from older societies. It implied that American expansion across the continent had been not just inevitable, but morally justified, a triumph of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures.
It presented simplified moral frameworks where good invariably triumphed over evil through righteous violence, justifying America's growing military and economic power on the world stage. What these myths obscured was the complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development. They often ignored the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the corporate manipulation of political systems, and the deeply divided communities struggling with fundamental questions about identity, governance, and resources. The real West offered no simple moral lessons, but rather a case study in how human societies adapt to challenging conditions, sometimes showing remarkable cooperation and creativity, other times descending into exploitation and brutality. As darkness falls once more, you reflect on your brief journey through the unromanticized Wild West. You've experienced firsthand why the average person today, accustomed to abundant food, medical care, physical safety, and countless comforts unknown to frontier dwellers, would likely not survive even a single day in the actual conditions of the 1870s frontier. The skills, knowledge, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience required for frontier survival represent a way of life so distant from modern experience as to be almost unimaginable. Yet, something about this world continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life stripped to essentials, where tasks have immediate consequences and achievements represent tangible victories against natural constraints. Perhaps it's the community interdependence that emerged from shared challenges, creating connections that transcended differences in background or belief. Perhaps it's simply the reminder that human beings can endure and even find meaning in conditions far harsher than most of us will ever face. The legacy of the American frontier extends beyond mythology into the actual structures and systems that shape modern American life. Property laws, water rights frameworks, federal-state relationships, approaches to natural resources, and countless other aspects of American governance emerged from frontier-era compromises and conflicts. The diversity of Western communities, despite efforts at forced assimilation, contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. Even the continuing tensions between individual rights and collective welfare, local control and national standards, exploitation and conservation have roots in frontier-era debates. For indigenous peoples, the frontier era represents not a glorious chapter in national expansion, but the devastation of ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty that continues today. Their perspective reminds us that the simple triumphalist narrative of Western settlement ignores the complex civilizations that already existed and the incalculable knowledge lost through their disruption. The most accurate understanding of the frontier requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, acknowledging both the courage of those who built new communities in challenging conditions and the devastation experienced by those displaced by this expansion. As you drift towards sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of this earlier America surround you. The whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant howl of coyotes, perhaps the faint piano notes from a saloon down the street. These sensory experiences, at least, connected all who lived through this era. Regardless of background or circumstance, the vast skies, extreme weather, imposing landscapes, and profound silences shaped everyone who encountered them, creating a shared relationship with the environment, even amid cultural conflicts. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again see a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a complex reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life, achieved through technological advances unimaginable to frontier dwellers. You might find yourself more aware of the skills and knowledge lost in the transition to our specialized technology-dependent society. The practical self-sufficiency that allowed frontier people to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with minimal outside support. Most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds who faced extraordinary challenges with the limited resources available to them. Their story, without Hollywood embellishment, contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, innovation, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness to fill countless histories. Their legacy lives in the communities they established, the environmental changes they initiated, the cultural patterns they created, and the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West disappeared long ago, transformed by technology, population growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet, echoes of frontier experience persist in regional identities, local traditions, land use patterns, and governance structures. The memory of this formative period continues to influence how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development, even as scholars and communities work to replace simplistic mythology with more accurate, inclusive understandings of this complex history. As you finally surrender to sleep, the boundary between past and present seems to blur. The challenges faced by frontier communities, adapting to environmental constraints, managing scarce resources, building functional communities among diverse populations, balancing individual freedom with collective needs, remain relevant in new forms today. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the frontier experience is not a set of answers, but a collection of questions about human adaptation, community formation, and the relationship between people and the natural world. Questions each generation must answer anew as circumstances change. The stars shine brilliantly above. The same stars that guided travelers across the prairie, helped farmers time their planting, and gave comfort to homesick immigrants far from familiar landscapes. In this moment of connection across time, you feel a fleeting kinship with those who looked upon these same constellations a century and a half ago, wondering what tomorrow would bring, in a world where survival was never guaranteed. But life, in all its harshness and beauty, was experienced with an intensity seldom matched in our more comfortable era. Sleep comes at last, and with it dreams of a West both harsh and magnificent. A place where human vulnerability and resilience were displayed in equal measure, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that would shape a nation, and where the daily struggle for existence contained moments of transcendent connection with landscapes of breathtaking grandeur. The real Wild West, stripped of romantic illusion, offers a window into human experience at its most elemental, challenging, frightening, and occasionally sublime. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with peace and the quiet echoes of history.